In this episode, I talked to Nathan Cheng. Nathan is on a mission to end aging. He's the co-founder of Longevity List and the Longevity Biotech Fellowship at OnDeck, known as ODLB. ODLB is a community for people to come together to build, join, and invest in revolutionary longevity biotech startups. In this episode, we talk about Nathan's mental models for longevity, what's missing in the longevity industry, how nuclear reactors are a good metaphor for aging, and optimism about the future of the longevity industry. I hope you enjoy. Cool. So I'm lucky to be talking to Nathan today. Nathan is the program director and co-founder of the Longevity Biotech Fellowship at OnDeck. And he also has a background in physics. And that's actually where I'd like to get started. So can you talk to me about how you got into physics and what the farthest, let's say, work or research that you did in physics was?
Yeah, sure. So how did I get into physics? Well, actually, my first degree was not in physics. It was in engineering physics, which, with a specialty in nuclear engineering. So
that's badass.
Yeah, so that was my first degree, my undergraduate degree. And yeah, I always liked physics, and engineering seemed like a very practical Asian sort of thing to do, right? My parents were not so approving of my switch later into graduate studies into physics, because they're like, oh, how are you going to feed yourself? But I always loved physics. Like, even at an early age, I remember my earliest sort of forays into physics. I don't know if you remember before we had Wikipedia, there was something called Encarta. Maybe you're too young for this. Oh my gosh.
I think I am. Yeah, I might be. Talk to me about Encarta. What was special about it?
So Encarta was like a software encyclopedia created by Microsoft. It was Microsoft Encarta. And basically you would put the CD-ROM into your, oh my gosh, I'm really dating myself now. You put the CD into your computer, right? And then then it would like have all these like different topics that you could explore. And it was basically like Wikipedia, CD-ROM. And I remember at a very early age, just like falling in love with this stuff and like just reading as much as I could about like quantum mechanics and like special relativity and just like these really cool ideas. And I think what really drew me initially to physics was just like the equations, which sounds weird, but yeah, it's like this mystery, right? Like when you see these equations and they say, oh, these four equations, describe all of electromagnetism. And you're just like, wow. And it's just like, it's almost like poetry, because there's like a hidden meaning in these equations that describes something so much more than just, those squiggly lines. It's just like, there's like a compressed amount of knowledge, just like, super packed in there. And it's so mysterious. So yeah, that's what sort of like drew me to physics. So I did my first degree in engineering, and obviously did a lot of physics in engineering school, but then I made the jump to graduate studies at the University of Toronto. Initially it was a PhD program in quantum optics, and basically, even though it's called quantum optics, what we were really doing was experimental work controlling, I guess, ultra cold atoms. So some of these would be bosonic sort of atoms, fermionic atoms, and cool them to like temperatures very close to absolute zero with lasers and magnetic fields and so forth. And and then we would see what sort of quantum phenomena manifest themselves at those temperatures. So that was really cool. I got like 2 years in and eventually dropped out, and then found my way to
But
that's I don't know. I'll just pause there, let you
happily ever after landing in longevity land. I mean, there's so many things I want to say. First off, I took a nuclear physics course in high school and barely slid out with a C. So I remember seeing like how we deconstructed atoms for the first time and being like, I don't understand half of what I'm looking at. And so I think it's brilliant that when you looked at the equations, when you looked at presumably things that were akin to either Feynman diagrams or Hamiltonian equations, you were just like, this is cool. Let me unlock this. Whereas for me, it was like, oh my God, I've gotten in over my head. But I came to really appreciate nuclear fusion actually as like a way to create other elements. So I want to double click a little bit and understand. You said your undergraduate degree was in engineering, applied engineering, and nuclear engineering, if I got that right. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so back then, if you could put yourself back in 18 to 22-year-old Nathan's shoes, how did he see the world that made nuclear engineering fit into like a, oh shit, this is like super useful for the world, or maybe something else that attracted to you? What was the mindset that attracted you to nuclear physics back in the day?
Yeah, I guess back then I was, when I started my undergraduate degree, the first sort of thing that I was thinking about was either doing like mechanical engineering, or I was thinking of doing aerospace engineering and so forth. But I think the thing that really drew me to engineering physics in particular was the physics part, and this idea of like more theoretical thinking, more abstract thinking. And then the nuclear engineering part just kind of fell into place because in the program that I was doing in the undergraduate, you choose engineering physics first, and then you can subspecialize into three different sort of streams. And one of them was nuclear and I guess energy, and then the other ones were like photonics, or the other one was also like I guess like solid state engineering, like chips and stuff like that. So those were like the options, and I don't know, I guess nuclear sounded cool, right? Like it just sounds.
It is cool, yeah.
And it has more. Well, they all have physics, in them, and they play a central role. But yeah, I think the first time that I got exposed to it was the nuclear stream was doing like a research project during the summer where we were trying to model different, reactor dynamics and stuff like that. So yeah, that was sort of like the first bug, and then it kind of went down that path. But at the time, like nuclear, I think back then, because this was kind of a long time ago. I don't want to say exactly how long, but back then, nuclear is not cool, right? Like I feel like
is it cool now?
It's not, but it has a resurgence, right? There's a lot of like well-known people on Twitter, VC, and those types, who are kind of like hyping up nuclear.
Yeah.
So it's starting to get cool again. And I think that's, partially, there's a bunch of different reasons why that might be. But yeah, back then it wasn't cool. But I just felt like nuclear, like this idea of, atoms and stuff like that. And also, fluid mechanics was kind of out there, like the Navier-Stokes equations and stuff like that. I had always known about those as like the clay math problems. And, I spent a summer trying, failing to understand that branch of math. But
oh
yeah,
my God.
So, it was cool. It was cool, just like just thinking about this potential, like this the potential of the nucleus of the atom, and
yes, absolutely. And I think to your point, like we take for granted just how the difference of one proton will change the entire electron cloud, and therefore the properties, frankly, of an atom, right? So like hydrogen and helium, one is extraordinarily inert, and kind of hard to get your hands on. Helium and hydrogen is found practically everywhere, right? Like everything is protonated. Not every biological system, but almost all of them have some hydrogen present. Almost none of them have any helium present. So it's crazy how different you can get in material properties just by, to your point, the atomic forces that are present. I want to ask one last question about nuclear before we get into longevity, which is where your bread and butter is. But what do you think like changed in nuclear that's now making it cool? Because to your point, I actually saw some VC, I believe it's Cantos, is doing like a $1 million check in a new like fusion startup, and they're like, hey, we want to find other people that we can invest in. But at the same time, if you look at sort of like politically what's happening, I believe it was France shut down, or Germany shut down one of their nuclear reactors, and it significantly put a load on the energy grid, and also cause more use of non-renewables like coal and gas to need to be spun up to meet up that new electricity demand. I personally think nuclear fusion and fission, because that's where we're at right now, fission has a lot of value. And I think there might be a little bit of a mismatch between culturally people understanding that, because maybe there's still an image of like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, et cetera. But what do you think has shifted from seeing it as like something no one's really paying attention to right, like you're saying, now there's cracks, people actually exploring it, new companies are being started, so on and so forth?
Yeah. This is a good question. I think there's a couple of reasons. Like one is the whole anti-nuclear thing seems to be a boomer phenomenon. And yeah, no, seriously. And maybe because, boomers
Oh
are
my
kind
God.
of, retiring and,
Yeah.
less politically active, perhaps. That's the reason why, nuclear is now seeing
Mm,
this resurgence. To
mm, mm.
dovetail with that, when we were, when I was in the nuclear engineering department, a lot of the professors there of nuclear engineering really hated The Simpsons, right? This cartoon show, because
Oh,
it
wow.
portrays, right, nuclear in an extremely unfavorable light, right?
Yeah.
And this cultural
Wow.
meme actually has a huge effect on, people's
Mm.
perception of the nuclear industry, right? So like, Homer Simpson is this oaf who doesn't know what he's doing and like, is in control of the nuclear power plant, right? And the person who owns the power plant is like an evil billionaire, Mr. Burns, right? And they always show like, nuclear waste getting like, spilled into the river, or like these cooling
Yeah.
towers with like these, noxious fumes coming out of them, even though it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah. Yeah.
vapor.
It's steam. Yeah. Come on, guys. Yeah. 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 So to your point, I feel like the characterization has put a really negative stain on things, and it kind of reminds me of I don't recall who said this, but it's sort of the arc of history. If you look at Disney World in the mid 1900s, there was all this optimism about science and how useful things like nuclear could be, and space exploration, and just like flight, just so much pro scientific. Let's say even rides that you had in Disney World. And then as the decades came on and we started to see some negative consequences of chemistry or of science, right? Like the nuclear bomb, of like chemical companies dumping waste into rivers. And we're seeing now like problems arise, frankly. The public perception around the safety or the excitement around science shifted from being like, yeah, science is going to save us, to like, oh, we need to be wary of science because it might hurt us and it could destroy what we have going for us. And I think that there's a tiny bit of validity in the argument, but I feel like it's been overly catastrophized, and the meme is propagated to a point where there's a lot of people that are very afraid of science. And it's my belief that science can help us solve the biggest problems that humanity faces. I mean, one of which is something we all face, and the fact of death, frankly. What do you think? Did any of that resonate with you? Do you disagree? I'd love to hear why you think I'm wrong.
I think, was it Balaji who said this, that like basically technology just increases variance, right? It's not so much that, technology is good or bad, but,
Yeah.
there's just so much more variation in outcomes when you start unlocking these new things that sometimes, you don't fully understand or don't fully have control of. When you start when you implement a new technology, there's all sorts of things that you might have not considered beforehand, before fully using them. And that's very pertinent as well when we get to the like biological domain, right? Obviously the idea of genetically engineering organisms and then releasing them out into the wild.
Oh yeah.
That's something that people talk about a lot, or like even genetically engineering ourselves, right?
Yeah.
That's happening, right? People are, gene therapy is a thing now, right? And and we're just doing it without well, we understand the science, but there might be some unforeseen consequences. But at the same time, I'm not trying to be like a fearmonger or anything like that. I'm all for like gene therapy and such, but we just have to recognize that just because we might encounter some hiccups, I don't want to downplay it, but some unforeseen consequences, it doesn't mean that we got to like throw out technology altogether, right? Like empirically speaking, technology, I think net has been good, but maybe some people don't agree, and maybe they would prefer that we all return to a sort of like a primordial or like sort of prehistoric state. I don't know. Who's it?
Yeah. I mean, I attempt to restore myself to a prehistoric state about once a quarter with a dopamine fast. So I can empathize with that camp, understanding that, technology really does seep into every part of our modern day lives. And sometimes it's a bit too much. But on the other hand, I think technology has brought about more prosperity than any other factor in human civilization or human life. And so it was something interesting that you said, quoting Balaji, that technology increases variance. I've always seen as technology increasing leverage. And to me, that goes to speak to, there's already variance that exists in human nature. I mean, frankly, the fact that we all have different genetic variation is a biological instantiation of the variance that Balaji was speaking about, or that generally you can see in outcomes. And what I think is interesting is because technology gives so much leverage, it makes sort of like the bad even worse, but the good so much better. And to your point, like I think the net on net of the bad with the good actually is a beneficial. And it's not like a 51-49. It feels like an 80-20, right? Like it feels like a significantly better outcome, but you will still see that 20% of the time you'll have this disastrous consequence. One thing that I thought was interesting as well is Gary Vee talks about how like cell phones are basically an ability for us to see even deeper into the human motivation. It's an amplifier for what we already do as humans. So people that are going to trash talk are just have now allowed our megaphone to trash talk through, right? The people who are very information hungry, like you and I, now have a new tool that's not Encarta, it's now Wikipedia that they can explore through, and YouTube and podcasts and so on and so forth. And so like I find that technology is just a lever for the things humans already wanted to do, then it is so much of like, let's say a negative impacting force across humanity as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It's interesting you brought up genetic manipulation, because I think that there is a very negative twist that's being taken on genetic control of all kinds of different species for all kinds of different purposes. One of the things that I thought was particularly interesting, and I'd love to see your take on this, maybe you know something I don't, is regarding the tweak some scientists are making, and I believe this is supported by the Gates Foundation, to engineer mosquitoes that can't carry the malaria virus, and releasing those into the wild to basically decrease rates of malaria. And then also I believe they want to do the same thing to reduce mosquito population in general, because insofar as I understand it, mosquitoes are the largest contributing disease factor or vector for human death across history, obviously not accounting for aging, right? So it's second to aging, but still, where are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, but yeah, I believe this was featured in the Netflix documentary, right? Unnatural Selection, right?
I haven't seen it.
Oh, definitely check it out.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's funny because, we have stories which act as like modern parables, and I feel like Jurassic Park is one of those parables, right?
Okay.
Right? Life finds a way, right? And in a lot of these these sort of projects where they're genetically engineering these organisms and then releasing them, usually what they do is they make them sterile, right? Or some sort of way that their lineage will terminate, right? And I feel like this is straight out of Jurassic Park, and it's like, okay, yeah, we'll make sure they're sterilized so they can't reproduce, and then we'll release them, and then somehow life finds a way, right? and then yeah, all hell breaks loose. So to me, I don't really have an opinion on this, whether we should be doing this or not. Yeah, like I can see both sides of the argument, right? Because there's potential, like huge benefit to eradicating malaria, obviously.
Absolutely.
But at the same time, there's maybe if you want to invoke like Taleb and be like, oh, maybe there's these these black swans, things that we can't really predict that could happen, and have large outlier effects. That's certainly possible as well, but at the end of the day, I guess I'll leave it to other people who have more knowledge about these circumstances.
Fair enough. So moving more into your domain of expertise, what mental models and what mindsets have been really useful for you to go from your deep physics background over to longevity, because the two are very, very different fields. So I'm curious how you got your bearings and what you took away from it, mental model wise, in order to get to such a good understanding that you have these days.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think when you go into a new subject coming from like a background in physics, what you really bring to the table is like the ability to think at a sort of fundamental, like first principles sort of way. I think Elon Musk talks about this as well when he approaches, his engineering mindset. And for me, I feel like longevity itself is a first principle sort of conclusion, right? If you think about it. And actually, that's probably why so many people in longevity who have non-bio backgrounds are actually from physics. So like Fleming, and a bunch of other people that I know. I think Joe Betz-LaCroix was also from physics or some sort of type of physics. But yeah, the idea here, Reason from Repair Biotechnologies and the author of the FightAging.org blog, incredible guy, is also from physics. I think he did astrophysics. But anyways, I'm digressing. The idea that that you should even be working on longevity is sort of a conclusion from first principles, because you're saying, okay, here's all these age-related diseases, and we can try and address them all sort of piecemeal or one by one, but you're kind of playing whack-a-mole here. But there's some sort of fundamental unification going on with all these diseases, right? In the sense that when you get older, the risk factor for all these age-related diseases like cancer, Alzheimer's disease, cardiovascular disease, they all go up exponentially as you get older. Right? So there's something going on here. There's some sort of like grand unification going, a theory of, aging disease going on. And as a person coming from physics, you think about that and you say, oh, well, we should go to the very root, right? What is the root cause of all these different things happening, right? What is the fundamental principle here causing these diseases? And it's aging, right? And thank God we have, several decades of scientific understanding of aging biology, so we can actually trace back some of these things that may be causing, aging broadly in, various model organisms and, also in humans. So, we've figured this out to some degree, scientists studying aging, and now we're really at this point where, we can start to intervene now instead of just, learning about what's going on. Now people have the tools and the ambition to actually try and intervene in the aging process, the things that are happening at a fundamental level. So I'll just pause there. Love to hear your response here.
So to your point, like there's an undeniable correlation between hitting old age and the incidence of disease, like no doubt there. What I find to be interesting is you're saying that with a physics mindset, it becomes abundantly clear that if you're going to try to attack all these different vectors, the thing they have in common is aging. So, why don't you tackle aging itself? What I find to be maybe annoying about the field is that unlike in physics, there's no fundamental, let's say, electromagnetic force or an electric field or a magnetic field that you can bring things in relation to one another. It seems to me from my rather uneducated perspective that there is no aging field as well, that there is no singular vector. I was actually talking to Max Hodak a couple of weeks ago in Boston, and one of the things that he expressed was that he feels like there's this, it's a really deep multivariable problem. So you have to solve many variables at the same time to really get solid aging. Whereas there probably isn't, he assumes there not to be one specific vector or one specific field, like I was mentioning earlier. Are we both uneducated? Is that true? Is that not? What do you think?
Yeah, so this is an outstanding question, right? I think the way people in aging sort of pose this problem is whether aging is programmed or not, whether there's a single sort of cause for all these mechanisms of aging. I would say if there is, we definitely haven't figured it out. That's for sure. We haven't discovered it. The central, I guess, the dogma, I don't know if that's the right word. The sort of the current understanding right now is that aging is a combination of all these different cellular and molecular processes, and people have different frameworks to describe these. There's obviously the Hallmarks of Aging paper, which was in 2013, which sort of lays out the main ones. There's also the SENS, 7 deadly SENS or whatever of aging damage, that is also popular. But yeah, that's sort of the current understanding, that it's just, very complex right now. And there's not one single thing that we can point to and be like, that's what's causing aging. And we just have to turn this one knob and then we'll solve the entire problem. Some people will sort of point to examples in nature where there are sort of like programmed aging or like programmed death. Examples, so like salmon, right? After they spawn, they'll die extremely quickly. And then you can actually intervene in that by, I can't remember exactly the mechanism, but there's a way to intervene in that to sort of change that process to
no way
not die so quickly. And
that's
then
crazy.
octopus as well. Like after they lay eggs, they'll die extremely quickly as well. So, I mean, in those cases, it seems obvious, right? But actually, there's like a whole philosophical argument here. Like, what does programming mean, right? Like, what does it mean for something to be programmed? Like, that's a very like human word to be using.
Sure. Wouldn't it just imply that there's like a biological or genetic basis, or maybe even like an epigenetic expression of whatever like the genome has as transcriptable as a process, right?
Yeah. This is an interesting point, because once you start expanding that definition, then you're like, well, a mouse, right, lives only like 2 to 3 years at most, but like a squirrel, which seems very similar, but just has a different, genetic code, lives, 10 to 20 years or something like that, right?
Sure.
So then you start saying, okay, well, then maybe it's just all programmed genetically, right? Then maybe all aging is just genetic, but then maybe that's not so useful if you're trying to stay within, your own species, because like, yeah, sure, I could replace my entire genetic code with that of a bowhead whale, and maybe that would turn me into a bowhead whale and make me live, over 200 years, but that's not so useful, generally speaking. I don't know, maybe other people feel differently about that. Sure. But but back to your point, Schrodinger, okay, so great, reference back to physics, right? So
let's go.
Schrodinger wrote this amazing book, What is Life, right? So this is extremely famous. It was, I think, in the 40s, before people knew about the structure of DNA, et cetera. He sort of used his physics thinking to derive some of the properties of, DNA before we even knew what DNA was. Like, they just knew that there was some sort of molecular basis for hereditary, whatever. But yeah. So with in that book, he makes a really interesting. He coins an interesting term, the 4D phenotype, right? So 4D. Instead of just 3D, right, like your body plan or whatever, right?
Over time,
the genetic code also determines, how long a species typically lives, right? Like that's actually pretty regular, pretty standard, right? Like this is
important, right? Because if nature's putting evolutionary pressures on you and you have a shorter time or a shorter life, you can iterate through your genetic code and actually find a superior way to adapt to the environment. So yeah, to your point, that makes sense. So keep going.
Yeah, so I always like this idea of the 4D phenotype, and that like somehow it's coded into the genetic code, or potentially there's some sort of thing going on in the genetic code. And people love to use long-lived organisms as like these aspirational sort of ideas to maybe how would we even translate that to a human. There are certain companies that take inspiration from what's going on in the animal kingdom and trying to translate them to longevity therapies, something like fauna bio, right? But yeah, it's not super clear how we don't really know which specific genes are causing a bowhead whale to live longer compared to us, or like a mouse that only lives a couple of years. But some general ideas are like there are some evolution selection pressures, right? So like smaller animals that are eaten quickly by predators, right, that have that sort of predatory pressure tend to live shorter, because they usually don't make it past a certain age anyways, because they'll be eaten, right? Whereas like larger animals, like whales and stuff like that, they tend to live longer because, not that many
Fewer predators.
predators prey on them. Yeah.
Yeah, but on the converse, I remember hearing this paradox, and I'm not very well educated in this space, so you probably know the name or have heard the reference. But it's surprising that whales don't have more cancer because they have more mass. So if you assume that 1% of all your cells, or 1.1 of percent of all of your cells will become cancerous, how come the incidence rates of cancer are so much lower than what we expect? So a really small like mouse, let's say, should have significantly less cancer, and a whale should have 1,000 times more cancer than we do, since they have 1,000 times more mass, roughly. But we don't really see that. So are we missing something, or is that just like one of the other unsolved mysteries in longevity?
Yeah, it's a good question. I believe that's called Peto's paradox. Don't quote me on that. But
Okay.
yeah, like you said, yeah, you would expect from like a fundamental perspective that longer lived, like larger organisms should get more cancer because they just have more cells.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, mice almost die exclusively of cancer, right? which is interesting. Whereas whales don't get that much cancer, elephants don't get that much cancer, and I think. I don't know exactly why that is, and I don't even know whether scientists know for sure why that is. There are some papers that seem to suggest that there's some sort of DNA repair mechanism that elephants and whales have, which allow them to evade this cancer risk. But I guess it's still kind of an open question.
Is DNA repair related to sirtuins and autophagy?
Yeah, so that's sort of the thinking that certain sirtuins might be involved in the DNA repair process. I think in terms of lifespan extension or lifespan studies, I think there's one paper where overexpression of SIRT6 in mice lets them live longer, right? So that's like a good signal there. And certain companies are pursuing this for therapies, right? So there's a company, there's a startup called GenFlow Biosciences, and yeah, they're basically trying to do a gene therapy of SIRT6 in humans and in dogs as well. I think in certain pets.
Wow.
So that's super interesting.
Yeah. Well, so when you say gene therapy, do humans have SIRT6, or so are we inserting that genetic code, or are we just epigenetically reactivating it because it might be dormant or what have you? How are we taking advantage of this mechanism?
Yeah, I don't know exactly what they're doing, whether it's just like some sort of like transient, maybe like an mRNA therapy or something like that, or something more ridiculous like AAV or something. Yeah, I don't really know exactly what they're trying to do there. I just know that yeah, they're attempting this certain approach with SIRT6. I think it would probably be like some sort of overexpression or something like that. Yeah. But yeah, the whole gene therapy space for like systemic gene therapy or that's still regulatory wise, that's still early days. So probably have a better chance doing it in dogs. And there's a couple of companies doing gene therapies for dogs.
My comment was about to be, well, we should be doing animal studies, right? If it's difficult to do on humans. The specificity about SIRT6 is, does that imply that there are other sirtuin factors like 1 through 5, 7, 8, 9, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I know the ones that seem to be most present in the literature are like SIRT1, SIRT6. I think SIRT1 mainly because of back in the day with like David Sinclair's work, with resveratrol and stuff. So that was sort of the first, I guess, longevity gene that people believed had a role in aging. But yeah, there's multiple genes. I guess these are all paralogs or whatever of a certain type of gene, that a family of genes.
Yeah, interesting. So it might be that we have entire, let's say, to use your word, families of genes that we need to be modulating or upregulating, turning on, that maybe naturally go dormant. That's super cool. So shifting gears a little bit, can you talk to me about what we need more of generally in the longevity space? Like you spoke to how we're a bit far away from seeing a lot of good human data in this gene therapy space. So that's obviously something that isn't quite ready yet, but we're excited. We're looking forward to that data. What are we missing, or what would help bring more prosperity and longevity sooner to the present? If you could wave a wand and make 10x of more of one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a great question. I think my intuition really is that we just need more people working on this, and there's on this problem, because if you think about just like the landscape of the longevity biotech industry right now, there's maybe 130 companies, startups working to develop, therapies targeting aging. And, it depends on how you count it, because, what is an aging company, what is not. But that's roughly this sort of order of magnitude, right? But if you compare this to something like cancer, right? Cancer, right? There's like 3,000 startups working on cancer alone in the Americas. And that doesn't include, big pharma, which is, they predominantly work on cancer anyways, right? So, lots of money, lots of, mind share, lots of resources and companies are being directed towards cancer, which itself, for the most part, is an age-related disease, right? So I feel like there's this huge mismatch in terms of just number of people working on this problem compared to the size and scope of the problem itself. So and there's various reasons why that's the case, why, everybody's working on cancer and not aging. But if I could just wave my wand, I'd be like, if we could just like 10x the number of companies, then we'd be sort of like in the same sort of order of magnitude in terms of effort as like a cancer, which, everybody agrees is something bad that we should work on.
Absolutely.
I think that's sort of the way that I would do it. But even this is like a interesting question. Like, how do you 10x the number of people working on a problem? It's not like a very straightforward solution. So there's maybe two different ways that I see, 10xing the number of people working on this problem. So number one, you could either just 10x the number of people who even know that this is a problem worth working on, right? Because this is actually not obvious. Like, most people don't know that aging can be modulated, right? No, not many people know that there are like biotech companies with clinical trials today, right? Like drugs in the clinic today being tested, developed in the context of aging. Like, if you ask people, not many people would know that, right?
Fair
so
enough.
Just general awareness, right? Letting people know that this is a industry, this is, an actual thing, that there's, legit science. I think that's super important. And, the work that people do, creating podcasts like yourself, or people, doing YouTube videos or blogs, newsletters, like all that really helps, like in a way that
Twitter.
Of course. This all really helps get, the word out there that, this is something that we should be working on, and that other people can work on it. So that's one thing you could do. And then the other thing that you could do is just 10x, I guess, the ease or make it just way easier to get people into this industry in the first place. So maybe you could just reduce the activation barrier or whatever by
catalyze the transition.
Exactly. Well, I guess you wouldn't have to reduce it by 10x. It would be like some sort of like exponential factor, right?
So, for all the scientists out there, we hope you enjoy this section. So, all right, if you had to take a bet, do you think that cancer companies would have more success if they focus their efforts on aging, since aging is an underlying let's say, amplifier to cancer occurring? Like, are they just uneducated? To your point, right? There's not enough people thinking about studying, asking the right questions about the field. So is that even some educated people that might be oncology researchers or cancer therapeutic companies?
Yeah, my intuition is it's not necessarily just about the education, because, I think there are enough companies out there like Unity Biotechnology and like BioAge who have made enough splash in the pharma world that people
Mm.
at least know they exist, so that people are
Mm.
working on this problem.
Mm.
But I think like classic example, Calico, right? So this is Google's
Google.
play, started in 2013. Great, everybody thought, hey, these guys are going to solve aging, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess it's 8 years later, and their first clinical asset is a cancer drug, right? So it's more that the money is in cancer, right? Usually,
No
the way
way.
that things go this way is, it's
Mm.
just easier to do a cancer trial, right? There's a lot of money in cancer,
Mm. Mm.
insurance, right? The payers, they're all aligned for people to develop cancer drugs, even if they're not super efficient, even if the approach gives minimal benefit. Maybe you add like a couple months of life, which for people who have the cancer, that's obviously really great. But if you're
Yeah.
thinking about compared to the promise of actually addressing all of these age-related diseases at their core,
Mm.
right, by targeting aging, like it's completely night and day. So
Yeah.
I don't know, like it's partially economic forces. I think partially we just need that 0 to 1, right? So some sort of clinical trial, some clinical data where we can demonstrate that we can modulate aging in humans or potentially in dogs first.
Yeah. Loyal.
Yeah, of course, and just to really get put aging on the map, right, and to really get over that barrier, because right now it's still early days. We don't have that first 0 to 1, and I think everything changes once we get to that point.
It's crazy to me to think that we are at the early stages of longevity and of aging. So like if you're listening to this and if you're thinking about getting into the space, know that you're still in early. Like I remember like even crypto as an example is in its early days. I remember Mark Andreessen having a quote back in the early 1990s saying when he came to Silicon Valley, he thought it had already done its thing and that he had missed the train. And if you look at it now, it's still a booming industry. And so, yeah, I think that to your point, like we're missing that 0 to 1 moment. And something that you said kind of resonated with me. And I think that you may be suggesting this, you haven't articulated it, so I'm going to try to put words to it. And it sounds like what you're saying is right now that the system that brings people healthcare is not built in such a way to be reinforcing people's longevity. It's for helping them with the diseases they already have incurred. And so even if we do get a 0 to 1 moment, even if someone shows some really good data in a clinical trial, would insurance companies know how to even price this kind of a therapeutic?
Yeah, so this is a huge open problem right now, especially for people developing drugs for aging, right? Because at the end of the day, there's two issues, right? The FDA, first of all, doesn't recognize aging as an indication, right? So how do you
Really?
do a trial for aging? There's ways to get around that. But yeah, number two, even if you could get it approved by the FDA, someone has to pay for this, right?
Exactly.
And the insurance companies, right? They probably want to see some sort of disease, and then someone a doctor prescribes a drug for that disease, and then you get reimbursed or whatever. So that's sort of the current paradigm. But with aging, what you're really doing is you're saying, okay, you don't have a disease yet. You have something that is causing diseases, right? But it does not fit in nicely into our categories, right? So then you have to give this drug to people as a preventative approach. I mean, we do have, potentially some examples with like statins and stuff like that, where certain drugs can be prescribed prophylactically in certain like narrow cases, right?
Yeah.
If you have a family history or whatever.
Yep.
But yeah, but for broadly aging, right? Like you're going to have to give these drugs to people who, quote unquote, don't have a disease, right? If you don't, aging is a disease.
Sure.
Then yeah, hopefully, some sort of insurance will pay for this. And it's not absolutely clear how that's going to work. The system is not designed for preventative medicine in that sense.
Yeah.
But I think there are going to be certain forays or certain developments into this space. So like in the cancer space, things like GRAIL, right, where you're doing a diagnostic test in advance, right, to to detect cancer, right? Like, I think people will want this test, right? And as it gets better, as they get more data, insurers will probably have to get on board with this at some point. But yeah, but it's still like an open problem in terms of like the business case of like actually doing a real longevity drug, prescribing it to people who are like in their 30s or 40s or something like that, like who don't have, a quote unquote disease. Yeah, I have no idea what's going to go on there, but hopefully someone will crack that code.
I wonder if that's one of the other factors that is causing this sort of chicken and eggs situation where like we're kind of lacking this 0 to 1 moment, and maybe more entrepreneurs would be inspired, or maybe more scientists would think to take the leap into entrepreneurship if there was a clear way for society to profit from, a lack of age-related disease. I mean, and it just makes sense, right? That we have some degree of healthcare costs that we take on as a society, and reducing those costs means people can work longer, they're healthier, they don't have to spend as much time, sick and whatnot. There's less emotional toll on the people that are around, right? All of those have loose but correlatable economic factors, right? Like you can put a price on therapy, you can kind of put a price on mental health, right? I mean, you see this when insurers have to pay out for like car accidents and whatnot, right? These things are quantifiable. As grotesque or cold as that might seem, they are nonetheless. And so it seems to me that either someone is intentionally not doing the math, or there's a debate, a lack of consensus by folks who are potentially controlling the flow of money to decide, hey, how are we going to price this in? Because if the market does make a decision and say like, okay, we think aging is worth $50,000 a year, then all of a sudden it seems reasonable to pay $35,000 a year for a drug that'll allow you to live longer because you're saving $15,000 every single year in potential healthcare costs. But it feels like that's missing. Did I get that right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a huge economic argument, right, to develop these drugs, right? And like, for example, Alzheimer's disease, right? By 2050, it's projected that Medicare costs and Medicaid costs for Alzheimer's disease will reach $1 trillion a year by 2050.
That's year?
That's just insane, right? Yeah, because the population is aging, right? And people.
Oh my God.
Yeah, that's just the way it is,
Oh my God.
Yeah, baby boomer generation, I guess, is top heavy in like skewed elderly, right? So yeah, like a huge problem, right? And Alzheimer's disease is extremely, extremely pernicious. So yeah, in terms of like trying to figure out how do we avoid those costs, maybe the government should think proactively about this. I think there are glimmers of people getting on board with this idea of like geroscience, geroprotectors, and anti-aging, whatever. So I'm not exactly sure where we are with it right now, but in the US, I'm in Canada, so this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, but I believe they had like a project, right, HARPA, right, which was like the sort of like DARPA for health or whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's $6.5 billion or something like that. But yeah, really focused on, okay, how can we do like do something about these age-related diseases, and other things like Matt Kaberlein, right, at University of Washington, who did a lot of great work on rapamycin and is still doing a lot of great work on rapamycin.
Nice.
So a great op-ed piece in The Hill where he was basically making a case for a geroscience moonshot, because there's like for just looking at it economically, like there's huge amounts of savings if we can just give people 1 extra year of healthy life, right?
Yes.
1 year is just insane. So yeah,
absolutely.
Read that piece if you haven't. Matt Kaberlein is an awesome guy.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. Something that came to mind immediately was, are we externalizing this cost as a society? Like, so that there's a common argument for those who are into thinking about climate change and renewable energy, that and generally chemicals as an industry in general, that we're externalizing the cost of polluting as a result of making our energy. So we don't actually price in the cost of bringing that carbon that we emit back into Earth where it belongs. And so that's not factored in, and someone else is going to have to pay for it later. It feels like aging is one of those things that we're paying for later. Is it something that is being externalized? Maybe you could speak to something that we could do societally. Like, does this require socialized healthcare to really get to a turning point of friction? It feels like there's several pieces missing, and I don't even know where to start, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting analogy, whether, these costs of aging are being borne by certain, people who shouldn't have to, bear it. I think, caretakers, right, when it comes to like Alzheimer's disease and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're taking this cost that doesn't show up in many respects, right? At least not in like Medicaid or whatever. But
yeah, John Oliver did a good piece on that.
Yeah. And then, so caretakers, bear the brunt of, the emotional toll and also, the economic toll. I don't know how you would bring that back, like, is there a market mechanism to force people to focus more on, the actual costs of aging? I honestly have no idea, but it would be great if we could, because, the costs are so high. And even, I mean, there's the economic cost, the emotional cost, but then on top of all of that, if that wasn't bad enough, right? Like all the suffering and all the money being, spent on these, therapies for age-related diseases that don't really work very well at all. There's just like lost potential, right? Like, right? Like if you believe that aging is something that we can do something about, and in the future, if you believe that we will solve it, then people living today dying of aging are dying prematurely, right? And every life is being cut tragically short, right? And there's all these things that they could have been doing that they'll never get to be able to do, and that's a huge loss, right? So like a couple of examples, right? This might sound a little weird, but like my grandmother just discovered YouTube last year, right?
Good for her.
Never used the internet at all, and then all of a sudden she's like, wow, there's this whole world out there of like content and like knowledge and stuff that I can just watch like at the
go grandma.
Yeah, and now she knows about YouTube, and like that's like a revelation, right? And maybe more serious, like for myself, how to explain this? I grew up in Canada. My parents were immigrants. My grandparents only speak Chinese, right? Cantonese. I don't.
Here. Not Chinese. My grandparents only speak Romanian. My parents are immigrants as well. We're both first generation. So
exactly. And for myself, because we grew up sort of in the suburbs, not in like in a Chinese neighborhood, I didn't actually learn to speak Chinese very well at all. So I never had like a relationship with my grandparents in like a way that like I could actually converse with them beyond just like, oh, have you eaten dinner yet? Yes, yes. Yes, no, grandma. But for me, it's just like, I spent some time in China when I was older, and I eventually, learned to speak enough Chinese that like when I got back to Canada, I actually had the first real conversation of my life with my grandmother. And I remember that conversation, after it ended, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about like, her running a business in Hong Kong with my grandfather, and leaving China because of the communist revolution and stuff like that. We also talked about Bitcoin.
Grandma's into Bitcoin. Let's go.
And it was great because after that conversation, like, and we there was like a I don't know, just like a silent understanding, unsaid, tacit understanding between us, that we just like, hey, we actually just discovered like, something new about each other, like that this was like a real, like the first time we actually met each other as like adults. Right? The entire time there is like, all I could think was, I wish my grandfather was here, because like then I could have asked him a lot of these questions, stories about his life and stuff like that. But his life was cut tragically short because, he died of pneumonia when he was older. So we never got that chance, to actually have these experiences. So I think, just this loss of experience and potential lives that are not being lived,
Yeah. That's, I feel that really deeply. And on Twitter yesterday, I found out October 5th, 2021 was the 10-year anniversary of Steve Jobs' death. And I read a really interesting piece by John Ivey, who's one of Jobs's best friends and coworkers, who helped. I think he was the chief design officer of at Apple, and he kind of spoke to this like emptiness that was felt just thinking about all the potential that was left. And I think I can only imagine how incredible it would be to still have him alive. And it's just like, I've never met him. I don't even own an iPhone, frankly, but I still think that like his contribution to the world is significant. I actually remember one of my favorite videos. He was talking about how computers will get to a point where you could have a conversation with an algorithm that is similar to Socrates, and how Steve Jobs wishes that Socrates could be, his tutor. And I think like, well, if longevity was solved, Socrates could be teaching a lot of people today, and we don't just have to read his handed down words and that were translated. We could actually get the person in the flesh. I think that there's a lot of lost wisdom and a lot of unfelt experiences that come when we lose people to age-related disease, or in general, frankly. I think that's like such a weird contrast to all the haters that you see of like that are like, oh, people shouldn't live forever, like, oh, think about how bad it's going to be, oh, like just all the rich people are going to leave us all in the dust. It makes me feel like they don't see the full picture, frankly. How does, or do you have a visceral reaction, or am I just the only one like deeply upset by that argument?
Yeah, like it, on the one hand, like it totally perplexes me, right? And it sort of makes me not mad, but just like, a little upset and so forth. But at the same time, like I kind of understand why, like there's like a semi-rational reason why people have this visceral reaction. And I think the best explanation is that people don't want to think about these things, right? They don't want to think about actually getting old and getting sick and getting these diseases that have no solutions, right? Like if you get Alzheimer's disease, if you're diagnosed with it today, it's just like there's nothing you can do, and you're just hopeless, right?
It's inevitable.
Yeah, and all these things are kind of like dark, and nobody wants to think about them. So they come up with like these psychological ways to sort of insulate themselves from the problem and just not think about it, right? So then they don't want to think about longevity or doing anything about these problems. They just want to live in peace and so forth. So that's sort of the reason I think people gravitate to some of these arguments. They just don't think it's possible to intervene. So then they just rationalize the opposite. So then they say, okay, well, if I can't do anything about aging, then maybe I should just like embrace it, right? And be like, okay, let's do healthy aging, which to me is an oxymoron. And friends use that word, healthy aging.
Healthy aging, yeah. It's like healthy carcinogen. It's like, hold on a second.
Yeah, like aging is what makes us unhealthy, right? Or more susceptible to disease. There's nothing healthy about it, right? But so we'll just like take the opposite view, and they'll be like, if I can't do anything about it, then let's just, if you can't fight it, just join it. So then they just like embrace aging and be like, oh, maybe, these, okay, set aside wrinkles, but like, they'll just say, hey, we'll just, embrace aging, and this is just the way it is, don't try and fight it, and then they'll come up with all sorts of nonsensical arguments to justify
rationalizations up and down the board. I feel like that's a characteristic of a lot of what I'm seeing in modern society. And I think taking the daily actions that are required, like exercise, being mindful of what and when you eat, and just generally putting in the effort to try and live a longer, healthier life requires a lot of work. Like it's a continual process. It's the thing you have to show up for every single day. It's a lifestyle, frankly. And I think that there are a lot of people who don't want to deal with that lifestyle. They just want to feel, comfortably rational in their own. And so casting aging as something that should happen and a good thing and a healthy thing, I think is a part of their way of saying, I'd rather just stay where I am. I want to be safe. I want to be comfortable. And because doing the opposite means looking the brutal, harsh, cold truth in the face, and meditating on your death, frankly, and saying, I don't want that to happen soon. I want to push that as far off as I possibly can. So let me do everything in my power today to buy myself the extra days, and those days compounded to weeks, compounded months, compounded to years, for my future. So yeah. I can't help but think that there's just so much entropy in aging. There's so many things that go wrong at such the same time. It's like it's a compounding negative force from so many different angles. Like your mitochondria stops working as well. You lose out on telomere length. You become more insulin resistant. Like all of these factors just start compounding and compounding, and it just feels like you're getting attacked from practically every side. Do you think that we have to kind of fully characterize biology so we can lift up each one of these factors individually together to kind of like solve the aging paradigm? Or might we be able to extend life or health span significantly without needing a full biological characterization of human life?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I feel like I've asked people in the scientific community about this before. Just like, what are like the Hilbert problems of biology or aging, right? Because at the end of the day, right, aging is really just systems biology, right? We have this complex system, and and it all goes wrong as we age. And in some ways, maybe the framing isn't why do we age, but maybe we should just be totally flabbergasted that any of this stuff works in the first place, right? And
yeah,
actually the default mode should be like everything should be just like falling apart. And the fact that we live, that we have 80 years or whatever of this, continuing when, by all sort of means, it should be, falling apart. That's sort of like the surprising part, not the aging part. Like homeostasis is surprising, not aging.
Yeah, survival is surprising.
So that's an interesting question about like whether we have enough biology figured out to actually thinking about aging. And I guess it depends on your question, right? If you're talking about A, do we have enough biology to fully solve aging, or B, just extend human lifespan past the maximum records that we have now? For question A, maybe we'll get to that later. But for B, I think the answer is pretty obvious. We don't need to know everything about biology to extend human life, right? We don't know everything about mouse biology, and we can like reproducibly like extend mice lifespan by 15% with just like a simple drug, right?
That's awesome. Yeah, right? 15% is incredible.
Yeah, and if you do like more interesting like genetic manipulations, you can get like 40% lifespan extensions. Wow. So yeah, and we don't know everything about mice biology. So that's an obvious answer to that part of the question. But if you're talking about, okay, well, I want to just like extend life indefinitely and have like a solved problem, something that we never have to think about in the future, just like
aging,
infectious disease right now. Yeah,
exactly. Yes.
That is harder to answer. So I guess it depends on a couple of things. So one, right, we might be able to do it if we get lucky, right? Like there are all sorts of like black box sort of like sort of things like Yamanaka factors, right? Cellular reprogramming is this huge, like really hot sort of approach that's gotten all the news lately in the aging space because of, Jeff Bezos and Yuri Milner starting up a company called Altos Labs and like funding it to like hundreds of millions of dollars. Okay, that's cool. Maybe that we'll get lucky and that just like solves most of the issues of aging, right? There's still, even if that works, there's still questions about like the extracellular matrix, because sure, maybe you can reset the state of a cell, but what about the stuff that's outside of the cell? Okay, but beyond that, maybe we'll get lucky. Okay, But suppose that doesn't pan out. There is one sort of approach that sort of fundamentally makes sense. And if you could quote, Elon Musk, like it is an approach or, a project that at least success is, one of the possible outcomes. Like
Yes.
you don't have to like de-risk all this like uncertain science. But in terms of engineering, it could be replacement, right? So if you think about, okay, let's go back to my favorite example, nuclear reactors, right? Nuclear reactors are an interesting model for aging, for non-biological aging, because they're one of the few very complex systems that we've engineered that we actually don't throw away, but try and extend their workable lifespans for decades. For actually, some of the oldest nuclear reactors are like 50 plus years, right? And they try and extend those lifespans even further, right? So actually, this is a great example, right, of what do humans do to extend their creations beyond typical lifespans. And so it's always the same. It's replacement, right? You take out the tubes that are all embrittled from neutron bombardment or whatever, and then you replace it with new tubes, right? And the great thing about translating this idea to biology is we know how to make new cells, right? The body is always making new cells, right? And because of the work of Shinya Yamanaka, we now know how to take someone's old cells, right, and reprogram them into stem cells, into embryonic sort of, well, not embryonic, but pluripotent stem cells, right? So this is like the missing sort of factor where we're like, okay, well, we can create all these cells. Now it's just a matter of like turning them into the right kind of cells and putting them in the right spot, right? So this is really just like, if you think about it from a fundamental perspective, we have all the pieces, right? But the engineering challenge here is just like unfathomably complex, and not that many people are even working on this particular approach for like full cellular therapy or tissue replacement or organ replacement with like 3D printing of organs and stuff. But I would definitely encourage people who are interested in this like engineering approach to read Jean Hebert's work. So he is a professor of neuroscience and genetics at Albert Einstein College of Medicine. And he wrote a great book called Replacing Aging, where he basically makes the case that we have basically all the parts, all the sort of parts needed to extend lifespan indefinitely and, actually fully solve the problem of aging. But it's still extremely difficult. It's not like, not to minimize or not to make it seem like it's an easy task, but that's one way that you could actually solve the problem, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, to your point, it's definitely not trivial, and I agree with you. We need more Elon Musks. Like, we need more people willingness to sit down and do the hard engineering problem and like rally the team, put their like life's work behind the effort. Because I think what I'm hearing is very encouraging to say that we have enough fundamental understanding of biology, of these cell repair mechanisms, these Yakanama factors, frankly, even things like imaging and control over biology, that it's now, like you're saying, a fundamentally engineering problem. And to compare it to what Elon did with Tesla, like, we already understood that we had lithium ion batteries that were functioning. You could make them in relatively high capacity. You could already take the body of an already existing car, and it was just about saying, and we had electric drive motors. Like, granted, they had to be tuned for this specific use case, right, to move the weight of a car. But have you just brought those components together and then put them in front of the right engineers to say, like, let's optimize around drivability? It turns out you can create a car that is amazing. It's fun to drive, and in a lot of cases beats out what traditionally is available on the market today. And so I think you're giving me a lot of optimism that we just need the right people motivated enough to sit down and do the engineering work that's out there. And one thing that I like, reflecting on it now, definitely when I was in school, and obviously when you were in school too, bioengineering wasn't a thing yet, right? Like you could be a biologist, and I chose to be a chemist and a materials engineer because I wanted to manipulate the periodic table, right? There was no opportunity for me to be a bio manipulator. I could just be a bio explorer as a scientist. But bioengineering wasn't a thing. I could do bioinformatics. And so I think we're now starting to see not just the wisdom and the potential in like companies like Altos Labs being formed, but those learnings being trickled down to the student like academic level, where we're now starting to see respect for aging and biological manipulation in academia. And so I'd encourage like anyone that is in academics or wants to be a student and who's passionate about aging to pursue the things that will allow you to get that step closer to working on aging and solving the problem that you're really passionate about, regardless of you know what the degree is titled, because it's an engineering problem that has to do with biology at the end of the day. Is what I'm learning through this call.
Yeah, interesting. You bring up that you know the use of bioengineering, right? Like even with like gene therapies, you're talking about like genetically engineered, right? Whereas if you're developing a drug, you call it drug development, you call it drug discovery. There's no word engineering that, you know, shows up in that domain, right?
Exactly.
So we are really entering like this phase where there is more information, right? Like bioinformatics and stuff like that. So it really is becoming more quantified and more like an engineering discipline, right? For biology in general. So yeah, and like even like cell engineering, right? Like they call it engineered cells and stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah, so totally agree with you. The framing of this as an engineering problem is very important, because at the end of the day, if we're thinking about just using a bunch of drugs, like small molecule drugs, and saying, okay, we're going to defeat aging by just taking some sort of cocktail of these drugs, like we're not even sure if that's if success is one of the possible outcomes if approach, right? Like you really don't know, right? Like we don't know fundamentally whether I can take a certain number of, you know, pills and then just do away with aging. Like that's not known. But, you know, with engineering, replacement parts through, tissue engineering or cell therapy replacement therapies, at least you know that success is possible there, even if it's extremely hard. But yeah, just putting that out there.
No. It's an absolute portfolio approach, and I think what makes me even more optimistic about the field is if you have an engineering mindset and you're saying, here are the boundaries around the problem, like we've quantified, here's what we know to be important and what we know to be useful, right? Like telomere length as one example. That's like a thing we know we can quantify has a correlation with aging, right? These Yamanaka factors as well. Then you can put a lot of the horsepower we're seeing behind computing into working on these problems. I mean, frankly, Google's what was it, the protein folding library was a huge boon for biology as a field in general. And I wouldn't be surprised if we now are able to understand how some of those proteins work that are involved in longevity and cell maintenance and cell repair. So I think that there is, it's startling to hear you say again, or to reflect on you saying that we're in the early days. But to your point, like, I don't think artificial intelligence and machine learning has fully hit the space. I don't think people from like chemical engineering and bioengineering have really like matured into the area. Like you were saying earlier, there's a lot of people working like pharma companies on cancer drugs that outweigh over an order of magnitude what's happening in the longevity space. It feels like there's a lot of opportunity here, and to your point of 2050 Alzheimer's alone, right? $1 trillion a year. There is so much money to be made for entrepreneurs who are willing to take the risk from actually tackling this problem. And then obviously, even more importantly, is the time that you get back and the time that you get to spend with the people that you love.
Yeah, going back to your economic argument, but actually before we get to that,
yes.
I just want to clarify, this whole like cell replacement or tissue engineering approach, as being like my favorite approach for solving aging. Yes, that's definitely true. But
you're biased, yeah,
totally true. But that doesn't mean like the whole pharma approach is not useful, right? Like doing something about aging, even like extending, human lifespan by like 4 or 5 years or 10 years or something, just with small molecule drugs. No, that's super important, because that is like an easy way to get to that first 0 to 1, because I don't think the replacement therapies are coming anytime soon for aging, but a small molecule drug, right, that just shocks everyone, shocks the world, saying, hey, yeah, this is actually going to modulate aging in humans. That's the 0 to 1 that gets everybody into the field. And then they can work on, better drugs or something else, like a different approach, like cell therapies. But yeah, back to your point about the economic argument of getting more entrepreneurs in because there's going to be lots of money. Yeah. So
Yeah.
someone like Jim Mellon, who's a billionaire investor in the space, has said repeatedly that this is going to be the biggest industry in the world, right? Like bigger than bigger than the internet or whatever.
Sure.
And I think that's true, right? Because if you think about like, so for example, Balaji Srinivasan wrote this blog article. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called The Purpose of Technology, right? And in the article, basically his argument is that, the ultimate technology is life extension, right? Because at the end of the day, technology, the whole purpose of technology is to reduce scarcity. And the thing that reduces scarcity the most is to extend lifespan indefinitely, right?
Because time is the most limiting factor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Time is the most limiting factor. Even Elon tweeted like a couple of weeks ago, just like time is the ultimate currency or something like that.
Yes, I saw that tweet. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So people are waking up to this, and obviously, billionaires who are who are getting to their 60s are also noticing this and realizing it and investing in companies in this space. But if you think about it, when we think about technology, you always think, oh, my iPhone or right? Or like a computer, right? And yes, an iPhone lets you do more stuff than you could without it, right? It lets you do things, iPhones get better and cheaper, well, maybe they get better with every year, maybe not cheaper, but like the whole idea is like, it helps you reduce scarcity by just letting you do more with the same amount of time, right?
Yes, exactly.
And Apple is one of the biggest tech companies in the world, right? $1 billion, whatever. And if you think about a drug that gives you indefinite time, maybe not indefinite time, but even if it gave you like 10, 20 extra years of healthy life, right? That's way more useful than your iPhone, right? Like if you ask like a billionaire who's 85 and has all this pain of arthritis, getting all these age-related diseases, whether they would rather have an iPhone or 10, 20 years of extra healthy life, like youthful life, like it's no brainer, right? Like, so
yeah. That reminds me of Naval's the young people want to be rich people want to be young. They just want to give away all of their money and start back again. Like Warren Buffett would give everything up to be 18 again and would get to where he was faster. I also think about like the potential of compounded knowledge. Like imagine what Richard Feynman could do now like with his mind with modern day physics. I think it'd be incredible. So listen, this has been great. I want to put a pin in and ask if you have any last thoughts that I've kind of matriculated off on the top. If not, we'll have to get to them on the second round.
Yeah, I mean, this was a great conversation. Got a lot of things covered, and I want to thank you for having me on your podcast, because I think it's a great service that you're doing. Getting people more exposed to this idea of longevity, because it really is the biggest problem that anyone can be working on. It has like the biggest impact and so forth. So really, really thankful for you talking with me, and it was a great conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and for you for encouraging me to get my voice out there.